We start with Aang having a nightmare. A vision of an upcoming storm. Zuko gets a similar warning from Uncle Iroh. Both Aang and Zuko don't want to acknowledge what might be on the horizon, but it comes anyway. In this episode, Aang and Zuko both find themselves in the same storm, bringing them back to the lowest moments of their pasts. And the ways in which they react to that storm and ultimately navigate through it say some truly profound things about what the storm represents. How exactly the storm starts can vary. In Aang's case, it's crass and obvious. A fisherman berates him about disappearing at the beginning of the war, affirming Aang's survivor's remorse of being the only surviving air nomad that caused his dream in the first place. In Zuko's case, however, it's much more subtle and innocuous. Zuko blows off the idea of changing course for the sake of the crew, saying that catching the Avatar is much more important than any individual's safety. Because of this, one of his crew says that he lacks respect. This elicits a violent reaction from Zuko because, as we later find out over the course of the episode, a lack of respect was the same justification his father used for publicly mutilating and banishing him from the Fire Nation as punishment for speaking out of turn in a meeting when he was 13. I want to pause here and highlight this as an example of the efficacy of using emotionally realistic depictions of trauma as exposition. I specify emotionally realistic because there's an extremely common misrepresentation of trauma in popular fiction. A traumatic event is commonly used as a call to action, the thing that disrupts the status quo and gives the protagonist the motivation to begin their hero's journey of confronting who or what is responsible for their pain. There's nothing wrong with using a traumatic event as a call to action, but the pitfalls of using this framework without regard for emotional realism is that it can operate under the misconception that trauma motivates confrontation, when in actuality it almost always motivates avoidance. The understanding of this simple fact is what elevates the storm to exemplary storytelling, because showing how characters avoid their trauma, especially the similarities and differences in which two parallel characters avoid their trauma, tells you so much about them in such a compelling way. Contextualizing a character's actions as avoidant behavior can completely change an audience's perception of them. Like, we've gotten a few sympathetic glimpses of Zuko before, but after this episode we never see him as just a villain ever again, because now we know, at least in part, that he's still dedicated to the Fire Nation because the alternative would mean accepting the fact that he's actually just another victim of it. He was exiled from it after being brutalized and disowned by his father. This contextualizes his character not as a villain, but as a deeply hurt adolescent, chasing what he sees as his one chance of having his father love him again. Zuko never cared about catching Aang out of some sense of patriotism. He's not chasing a threat to the Fire Nation. He's chasing his one chance of getting to go back home to his family and just have everything go back to normal.
Things will never return to normal. But the important thing is, the Avatar gives Zuko hope.
In a worse version of this story, Zuko would have immediately realized that his father was abusive and joined Aang right away. But that would mean Zuko, at 13, would have to immediately understand that what his father did to him was wrong. And the writers understand that no matter how cruelly they're treated, that's something most children are just unable to do on their own. Instead, he does the same thing that Aang and a lot of other traumatized children do, which is blame himself. For Zuko, it's easier to travel around the world for 3 years searching for the forgiveness of the man who literally scarred him for life, than it is to come to terms with the fact that his father is a monster. Just like it's easier for Aang to tell himself that he should have stayed at the air temple during the attack to help the other air nomads, even though in reality it would have just meant him dying along with them. These are the type of narratives that a lot of people who experience trauma, especially children, cling to. But these narratives aren't just wrong, they're completely unsustainable ways to think about yourself. That you're somehow a coward for surviving, or that you deserved your abuse. A storm makes a great analogy for trauma because you cannot outrun it, and it does not care if you ignore it. You cannot control when a storm comes, but you can control how you navigate through. The most turbulent and violent part of the storm is its periphery. And the fact of the matter is, by the time you see the storm, you're in it. By trying to run away or ignore it, by clinging onto these narratives, you're not successfully avoiding being in the storm, you're just prolonging your time spent in the worst of it. So if you can't avoid the storm, and the periphery is its worst part, where does that leave you to go?
We must head directly into the eye of the storm.
So how do you get to the eye of the storm? Well, Aang and Zuko get there and are able to achieve a modicum of peace and growth by challenging their given narratives. Aang interrogates his narrative with the help of Katara, coming to terms with the fact that his life being spared is a blessing. And although he was unable to help his people back then, because he survived, he's in a better position than ever to help people now. The pain and loss are still there, but now he has something new and better to tell himself when the next storm comes. As for Zuko, he doesn't replace his narrative, at least not yet, but he still challenges his narrative by allowing himself to temporarily operate outside of it, by letting self-preservation take over.
The Avatar!
What do you want to do, sir?
Let him go. We need to get this ship to safety.
He still thinks that finding the Avatar will fix his relationship with his father, but he's now able to admit that finding the Avatar is not, in fact, more important than any individual's safety. And for now, that's enough. Neither of these characters fix their trauma. Both Zuko and Aang grapple with the same feelings throughout the series, because changing how you react to trauma is a lifelong process. It's a muscle you have to build over time. Change can only come over the course of many storms. It's bitter work, but eventually, after years of practice, you can learn to experience trauma not with avoidance or a harmful narrative, but with dignity and self-control. That is to say, by grounding yourself, letting the surge of pain flow through you, and then letting it go. There's no right way to feel trauma, but if you examine and adjust how you navigate those feelings, you'll be amazed at how you can handle future storms.